Before I get started, I want to acknowledge two people in the audience, Sadat and Maria Bakai, who actually got this whole thing started on Fire Island in really after 1989, and inviting Jay Kirkpatrick and John Turner and Erwin Liu to come. And it was through their work with the deer and with the community and with the Park Service and other folks that enabled us to get that project started and keep it going for many years. So thank you. And thank you for coming. And isn't it sad that we're still doing this after 25 years? So anyway, I'm going to take you through a quick tour of kind of the scientific logic of the field studies that we've been doing. And I'll refer at various times to the studies that we've done through the years, and bring us up to where we are now, and where we hope to go. So, wildlife contraception has actually been around for a long time, and the immunocontraception piece of it has really been going on since the late 1980s. It is being widely used in other contexts aside from deer. So it is being used by Native American tribes and by the Bureau of Land Management and by the National Park Service to manage wild horse herds. It's being used in South Africa to manage and control populations of African elephants in game ranches that have finite resources and which are interested in keeping their elephant populations stable. It's also being used on bison in Santa Catalina Island and in zoos all over the world. So it's really a pretty well-established technology in the sense that so many people have used it on so many different animals in so many different contexts that we know most of what there is to know about it, at least in terms of its safety and its efficacy. So we use, as we've discussed before, the porcine zona pellucida vaccine, PZP for short. Again, it is a protein that is extracted from pig ovaries, and therefore is biodegradable and not active if you eat it. It becomes digested like any other pig proteins. It works with this very nice mechanism where PZP vaccinated females produce antibodies to the porcine zona pellucida, and those antibodies then bind to the zona pellucida of the female treated and prevent sperm from attaching. So it's a very narrow and effective mechanism. There's nothing else in the body that looks like zona pellucida proteins, and so we don't have issues with autoimmune or cross reactions or anything like that that might have some adverse effects. What we call native PZP, which is similar to what was first used on Fire Island, is now registered for use on wild horses as Zonistat H and for deer as Zonistat D as of July. Deer immunocontraception started really with John Turner in the late 1980s, working with a captive herd in Ohio. But the team of Jay Kirkpatrick and John Turner and Erwin Liu has really driven this. Of course, we lost Dr. Kirkpatrick in 2015. We've had a number of collaborators. Of course, the HSUS, for which I was on staff for much of the early parts of this work, Tufts, University of New Hampshire, National Park Service, Biological Resources Division of the USGS, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and the residents of many of the locations that we've worked have played vital roles in making these projects go. So, where we are now. Okay, so over the years, we have pursued a number of critical research questions to establish or demonstrate the circumstances under which PZP could be used, if it can be used, to manage suburban deer. So the first three questions are really Jay's questions. Is the contraceptive agent effective when it's delivered to individual animals? And can it be effectively delivered in the field and still be effective with the animals that it treats? And then finally, can contraceptive agents stabilize or reduce the population? So these are conceptually pretty different, and when people ask, well, does it work? It's hard to answer that because there are many different answers to that question depending on what level you're talking about. Where we really are now is the question, as Tony discussed, of can we make it into a practical and cost-effective tool for managing suburban deer and managing suburban deer conflicts. And so the sort of sub-questions there are how accessible, it's hard to see. Yeah, the red is hard to see in the light. Is there any way to turn down? I don't want to touch anything because the room will take off. Okay, so in any case, what I'm saying here is where we are now is, can immunocontraception be made into a practical and cost-effective tool for managing suburban deer? And of course, as Tony pointed out, it's only going to be applicable in certain circumstances. But what we're trying to do is expand the range of environments and deer populations where it can be used. So the first question, again, is how accessible are deer for treatment? How is it delivered? How long does the contraceptive last? And how does contraception then, at the population level, interact with natural recruitment, mortality, deer movements, all these other kinds of things, which are all essential to resolve at the population level, and which may differ from community to community. Okay, so the vaccine can be delivered by hand or by dart, if we're going to do it by hand, again, typically we have to capture the animals, but it can also be delivered directly by dart, which is what was done originally on Fire Island. And that's Rick Noggle sticking a dart in a gun, probably at Fripp, I'm guessing. We're working with two different vaccine preparations right now. What we're calling native PZP, which is the Zonistat D, the kind that's been approved, is just a simple vaccine emulsion. It's the vaccine itself, the antigen itself, mixed with an adjuvant. And I won't go into details on adjuvants. But this is cheap. This is $25 a dose. This is what we stuck in darts in Fire Island and other places. In the form that it's in now, it requires annual boosters, at least for the first few years. And it's most effective if the booster is given in autumn. So that is the sort of traditional, cheap version of the vaccine. The issue, of course, is if you have to give the animals annual boosters, that pretty much limits the number of places you can work to Fire Island and maybe half a dozen other places in the country. And so much of the research that we've been doing over the past 20 years or so has been based on trying to extend the longevity of the vaccine, to come up with something that will work for 2 or 3 years with a single initial treatment, and then with subsequent boosters. So that consists of the simple emulsion, the native PZP, and a series of timed release pellets, which are made of the same polymer that surgical sutures are made of, so for the most part. The price has historically been about $225 a dose, but it's been subsidized by the Bureau of Land Management, and those numbers are rising now. And so one of the things we're interested in doing is driving those costs down. We have the treatment, and we'll talk about the results a little bit, does last 2 to 3 years. We don't know yet how long boosters last, at least not in deer. But it can be administered year-round, and typically we usually give the first shot in February, March, when the deer are most accessible. So we have these two different things. The control release PZP thing has been dubbed PZP 22 by the Bureau of Land Management. We never liked the name, but it's stuck and we're going to use it. So we have the two kinds. We have the Zonistat, the native PZP, and the control release PZP, or PZP 22. So just going back through the history a little bit, the first question is the contraceptive agent effective when it's delivered to individual animals, was answered by John Turner on captive deer, again, in the late 1980s. And He delivered the vaccine by DART to, I think, about 7 or 8 captive deer and captive female deer, and it worked perfectly, and he published those results in 1992. So then the next step was, okay, we've shown in principle that it works with captive animals. Can we do it in the field? And so the answer for that also turned out to be yes, and that was what we established at Fire Island National Seashore in the initial phase of that work, and that was published in 1997, and more was published a little bit later. So with respect to this question, between 1993 and 1998, we delivered the vaccine directly by DART to animals that had not been captured, and Maria and her volunteers were identifying individual females by markings and by their association patterns. Individual females tend to stay put, and they do tend to associate with the same individuals. So Maria and her colleagues used that and would bring John and Jay and me to particular deer and tell us which ones still needed to be treated. And so in that study, the fawning rate, the percentage of females that had fawns that were not treated typically were 80% or higher, which is very, very typical for suburban herds. In the first year after treatment, it dropped to 30% and then went down to 10 to 15% after subsequent boosters. So yeah, we were able to do it in the field there under pretty exceptional circumstances. But it answered question number 2, at least in principle. The third question is can the contraceptive agents stabilize or reduce populations? And that was also answered in the affirmative, first at Fire Island, in the Kismet to Lonelyville communities especially, where it was most effective. But we also replicated that at Fripp Island in South Carolina in a subsequent study, also published. So we worked at Fripp, and Mark Fraker was there with us too in the first few years. Fripp's a really nice place to work. And so it's about 4 square miles. It is an island. It was effectively isolated, separated from other deer populations by strips of water that, in theory, probably could have been traversed by swimming deer, but didn't seem to be much. It's a lovely residential and retirement community, 2 golf courses, pelicans and dolphins, and lovely things like that. But they had a huge number of deer there. They probably had as many as 450 deer on their 4 square miles when we first arrived there. And incidentally, they did initially look at lethal approaches there, but because of the patterns of development and the absence of any open space and the proximity of the people and the deer, they ended up discarding any sort of lethal approach there. So over about a 5-year period, we captured and ear tagged and treated with the PZP22 vaccine, the longer-acting vaccine, or what we hoped would be the longer-acting vaccine, 258 female deer. We got the initial population decline at Fire Island, but the decline here was a lot faster, probably because we were working more intensively, and also because Fripp Island was effectively more isolated than the Fire Island communities, which did in fact have deer moving up and down the island, in and out of the study areas. So what we have here is the fawn-doe ratios at the population level for Fripp Island, which is the solid line, and Hunting Island, which is a control, which was ironically not hunted, but it was a state park that was across about a half a mile of water from Fripp Island. So it was a close match. And so what we saw over the 5 years that we worked at Fripp, a very dramatic decline in the proportion of does that were seen with fawns. And so that went from about 1.2 fawns per doe to about 1 per every 5 does. So there was a pretty dramatic drop there in fawns at the population level. And this was matched by a decline in the population. We're actually still to this day not sure what was killing deer on Fripp Island. There were very few cars. There was really only one road that had a 25-mile-an-hour speed limit. Most transportation was by golf cart on these little paths, little dirt paths. And so it probably was not cars, but they did have a lot of alligators. So it may have been alligator predation. It may have been disease or other kinds of things. But whatever it is, by shutting off the fawns at Fripp Island, we got a very steady decline in the population over the years. And so the numbers dropped from about 70-some per square kilometer to about 35 per square kilometer. So it dropped, the population density dropped in half over the 5-year period that we were working there. And meanwhile, the population density at Hunting Island remained at roughly the same level. And so by the end, the population level at Fripp Island had almost reached the level at the Hunting Island control site. And so that was very dramatic. And so the answer to question 3 was yes. We can control, at least in some areas, on islands and other places, some deer populations. Which then takes us to the last question, which is where we are now, which is, can immunocontraception be made into a practical and cost-effective tool for managing suburban deer? And I should add to that, where and under what conditions? So we're interested in seeing, we know we can do it at Fire Island, and we know we can do it at Fripp Island, but can we do it in, again, sort of more open populations where deer can, at least in theory, move in and out without a significant geographic barrier. So part of making it into a more practical tool was the testing of the PZP22 vaccine. Can we reduce the number of times that a deer needs to be treated in its lifetime in order to effectively control reproduction? And so, again, at Fire Island, it was possible to treat deer every year. At Hastings Island, it's possible to treat horses every year. But in most places where communities are experiencing deer conflicts, this is not going to be an option. So we have tested the longevity of the PZP22, the control release vaccine, at Fripp and at Hastings on Hudson now, which brings us to the current location. At Fripp, what we showed was that, again, the typical deer, 80% of the deer were having fawns every year. But reproduction after 1 year at Fripp, after treatment at Fripp in March, was 4%. It was very close to 0, which is very exciting. It was a little higher the second year, but still quite dramatic. And the third year, there was also an effect, but it's not as large as was shown there. But there was also clearly some effect into the third year as well. So what this suggested is we do not have to give them 2 shots in the initial year and boost them every year. We can catch them in February or March, give them 1 shot, let them go, and see at least 2 years of contraceptive effectiveness, which is kind of step 1. Which brings us now to Hastings on Hudson, which is about 10 minutes to the south of here. We started this project in 2014. Tufts, the Humane Society, the Village of Hastings on Hudson, which, as Dan will talk about later, has been a super active participant in here, in this project, and also worked with Mark Weckel of the American Museum of Natural History on some of the population assessments. So this is what we started thinking about when we came here to Hastings. We wanted to first show that the Fripp Island data on PZP22 were not some kind of a weird fluke. We wanted to replicate that study because that's a really important piece of what we're doing. It's also, in all the years that we have been studying PZP on horses and on deer, nobody really looked at the efficacy of boosters. We always stopped after the first one and celebrated and went home. So let's do the follow-up, and let's boost some of these PZP-22 treated females with a PZB vaccine, and then see how long the booster lasted, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more. Third, again, to look at this issue of a more open population. Hastings on Hudson has the Hudson River on one side, and it has the Sawmill River Parkway on the other side, which it turns out is not actually a barrier, but certainly it's open north and south to free movement of deer, which we'll talk about. And can we still have a population effect in this more geographically open area, or an area that's permeable to deer? And we're also interested in developing new tools for deer population estimation, which I won't talk about yet. Hastings on Hudson is a tough place to catch deer. When Rick and Kayla were here the first year, they only caught 8 deer, and most of that was because of not paperwork issues, and so they were only out here for a couple weeks. But since then, we've been able to capture about 20 deer a year in the wintertime. It has been challenging because of weather and other kinds of things, but we've managed over the years to conduct 75 captures, and 69 of them are different females. We have had 1 mortality in this past year out of the 75 captured. So yes, indeed, the PZP-22 vaccine works as advertised, although it looks like it was a little bit worse the first year and a little bit better the second year. Those are statistically indistinguishable from the Fripp data. So maybe the Fripp data were a little low, maybe these data were a little high, but it's in the ballpark. So we're still seeing something like 2 years of effectiveness with the PZP-22 vaccine here, which is pretty exciting. And if anything, the fertility among these deer is even higher than it is at the other sites where we've been working. So that might also account for a little bit of the difference. So virtually every adult female over the age of 2 that we caught was pregnant at the time of capture. So it's a very prolific and fertile herd that you have here in Hastings, short of interference. So the next thing we want to do, we want to work on is, again, continue to reduce or eliminate the need to capture deer for treatment. And so we've been hand injecting the deer in their initial shots, but we also want to see whether a remote booster will work and how long it will work. So we have started, I guess 2 falls ago, we started treating the deer that were first treated in 2014 with boosters. And we only have like 5 deer at this point and for 1 year. And it's working pretty well, but that doesn't, it's just the initial data. The interesting new data that's emerged is actually for wild horses. And for the project that we carried out, that HSUS and I carried out with the funding from the Annenberg Foundation at Cedar Mountains Herd Management Area and Sandwash Basin Herd Management Area, first in Utah and second in Colorado, we actually did do booster tests there, and it turned out that both the Zonistat, the basic native emulsion, and PZP-22 as boosters showed roughly 3 or more years of effectiveness. So they were treated either by hand or by dart, at Sandwash by dart, at Cedar Mountains by hand. But both worked for, again, at least 3 years. And I say at least 3 years. We got a 4th year at Cedar Mountains, which seemed to show that it did work for a 4th year. We didn't have any more data from Sandwash. But the boosters seem to work really well there. And so what we're now looking at Hastings is looking at whether a similar effect can be seen with boosters there. Of course, because the native PZP is much cheaper, if we can initially vaccinate the deer with the PZP-22, and then we can just boost them with the $25 emulsion and get 5, 6, 7 years out of contraception from those 2 2 injections, that will be a lot cheaper. But we don't know that yet. So that's one of the things that we're testing now. So some other things that we've learned at Hastings that sort of address these general issues of practicality. Yes, Kaylee, that's number 13. And number 13 is a male. It's one of our early little goofs. So anyway, deer here at Hastings, like pretty much all the other suburban populations that have ever been looked at, the females pretty much stay put. So each year we get maybe 10 to 15% of them disappear, and we don't know where they go. So we know that some of them die, but others have been reported in odd places. But from year to year, 85 to 90% of the females stay put. And often we find them within 50 or 100 yards of where they were originally darted. So there's a lot of site fidelity for these females. As again, seen in every other suburban deer that's ever been looked at, known females hang out with the same known females year after year. And that's, again, what enabled Maria and her compatriots at Fire Island to help identify individual deer. So they do, in fact, associate in family groups and again, hang out in the same areas. There is no stream of immigrant females coming from Dobbs Ferry and Yonkers. And so female deer here are behaving the way they do in most populations. So the stability of female populations is not an obstacle in this case. What we are finding here is that Hastings, at its 4 or so square miles, is actually a little small for a deer management unit. So we do have a significant number of females that spend part of their time in Hastings and part of their time in Dobbs Ferry. We also have a community of deer in a school that we do not have access to on the south side of town, which runs into Yonkers, which houses a significant population of deer, and they do leak out into the southern areas of Hastings on Hudson, and sometimes we can get them, but usually we can't. And so, plus, as I mentioned earlier, we also have deer that cross the Sawmill Parkway at 3 o'clock in the morning regularly. And so there is this sort of edge effect where we don't really know how many deer we have at any given time because deer do move in and out. But again, these are edge effects. These aren't strange deer. These are deer who happen to have their home ranges that overlap the boundaries. And so that kind of access challenge is the same kind of challenge that you experience with any kind of deer management techniques or localized deer management techniques. We've done some impact measurement. As Dan and I were talking about at lunchtime, the forest there is pretty much denuded. We've got some deer population estimates. We're not happy with the way we've been trying to calculate deer population estimates, but it's something like 150 deer at this point, and which is a lot, 50 deer per square mile. But again, there's a lot of uncertainty because deer move on and off. We've also been looking at vegetation impacts, which I'll talk about for a second, and I guess there's some data on deer vehicle collisions, but there seem to be so few of them that it's not a great metric. And so the variations from year to year may not have anything to do with the number of deer. So anyway, this is the Host to Hosta program at Hastings on Hudson, and this protocol was basically stolen or borrowed from Bernd Blasi at Cornell, who has a similar protocol for measuring oak regeneration. And so the community here, under Dan and Peter and some other folks, have been putting out about 50 hosta plantings in backyards in May every year, and we look at their survival before the deer get them. And if you look at the first year, which is the dark one over there, they, within a week to a month, almost all of them are gone. And a few of them, maybe about 9%, survive the year. But it's it's only 3 data points. But right now, it's looking a little bit better. In the most recent year, in 2017, a quarter of the plants actually survived the year. And so they seem to be doing a little bit better as an index. And we don't know why. We have 2 things going on. If there is a population reduction of any sort, that might be having an impact. But the other thing that we saw on Fripp as well, at least anecdotally, is that females that don't have fawns don't eat as much. And so, and we saw that in terms of the conditioning of the females at Fripp and other places from the beginning to the end of the study. And I don't know if there was a huge amount more food there, but certainly the females were in better shape. And we're thinking that may be affecting the impact as well. And anyway, we're really excited to keep continuing this and to see whether this trend is real or whether we just got lucky. So we're saying we should publish this now before we find out that it's not true. But anyway, the trend is good so far. Anyway, looking ahead at the Hastings project, we finished our winter captures. We are compiling the booster effectiveness data. So we have our first year on our first cohort. This year we'll get our second year on that cohort and the first year on the next cohort. And we will see how long the boosters are lasting. I think in talking to Peter and our own observations, the fawn numbers is visible. The decline in fawn numbers is visible. And that's certainly what the initial sort of surveys seem to be reflecting, that we are seeing a decrease at the population level and the proportion of females who have fawns out there. And we are working to refine and augment the population estimates. Going on from there, we're also extremely interested in looking at this issue of captures. And as we've discussed, capturing deer is a lot more work and a lot more time than just hitting them with darts. And Kaylee will present some of the figures on that. And so right now we're thinking in terms of what can we do to identify deer without touching them? And so we have a couple things that we're working on in terms of using microchips and some other things that we started thinking about in terms of facial recognition software, which is getting better and better. And it turns out I have a colleague at Tufts who's the dean of the engineering department of the engineering school there, who does pattern recognition stuff. So we're hoping to work with them on those issues, both here at Hastings and also at what we hope will be our next site at Head of the Harbor in Long Island. So anyway. Lots of people have been involved in this and the Hastings study. Thank you and kudos to the village for support. And we want to also thank Dr. Richard Joseph from the VCA Animal Specialty Hospital at Yonkers, who's overseen our access to controlled substances that we use for deer immobilization and has also served as our emergency vet. We've had several funders. I should also include Animal Welfare Institute there, In Defense of Animals, Burkett Plaque Foundation, and the Bot Stever Foundation, and of course the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, which has been permitting this and sort of advising us on these projects all along.